I'm going to give you some information that might be helpful so you could decide whether you want to become a registered nurse. A registered nurse is one of the largest health profession in the United States. There's about a little under 5 million registered nurses. So in this video, that's who we're going to be talking about. I'm a registered nurse, and I'll give you what my educational background was to become a registered nurse. So one of the challenges about becoming a nurse is choosing what kind of education you need. To obtain a registered nurse license, you'll need to go and take a test. Test will see whether you have enough education to properly take care of patients. Before you take the test, you have to enroll and complete in a school that is accredited to teach materials for registered nursing. Nowadays, most hospitals will want to see that you have a bachelor's degree in nursing. If you're looking to obtaining your registered nurse license, I would highly recommend that you do obtain a bachelor's of nursing rather than an associate degree. And I'll tell you why. Data shows that bachelor prepared nurses are more prepared to take care of patients. The curriculum of bachelor's degree is a segue to obtaining higher education. So if you want to become a nurse practitioner, you'll need some form of bachelor's degree in order to enroll in a master's in nursing program. That is the basic education that I recommend. You'll meet a lot of nurses who have associate degrees. You'll also meet some nurses that have diploma. Historically, when nursing the profession was being formulated, the hospitals offered these certificate programs. Then came the bachelor's program, and there were nursing shortage. We introduced also associate degree programs, where it's essentially you go through a community college program, and the program itself is shorter. So that is perhaps favorable to people who work full-time. However, most hospitals that are what's considered magnet hospitals will look at resumes primarily of people who have graduated with a bachelor's degree. For myself, I was lucky enough to where I found a program that what's called accelerated programs. I don't believe they have those anymore, but when I was entering into school, because of the shortage, there were some institutions that essentially said, hey, look, if you already have a bachelor's in a different discipline, come and join our institution. You don't have to go through the general ed stuff. So you saved at least 2 years of additional education because you already got that from your previous bachelor's degree. I ended up doing a full-time program that was around 13 months. It's at Johns Hopkins University. They don't offer that program. They did it for 1 year, and I happened to be in that year. What ended up happening is the school at the end merged our 13-month program into their traditional bachelor's program. One of the other options, if you have a bachelor's, is to go into a master's in nursing program. There are universities like University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, that have programs. If you have a bachelor's in another discipline, you can enroll in their master's program that will give you the education that you need to test for the registered nurse license. But at the end of the education, you come out with a master's in nursing. So bachelor's of nursing is one of the fundamental education. You might ask, well, what's the school like? So one of the things about nursing is that we have all personalities going into nursing. I went in because I tend to be one of those people that like to help people. I highly recommend that if you don't have that kind of tendency, nursing probably isn't right for you, or if you do go into nursing, you could find specialties within nursing that have minimal patient interaction. But if you really love patient interaction, nursing is such a great career financially, and as far as moving up the ladder, there's so many avenues that I think it's a great profession to go into. In the bachelor's program, if you don't know what kind of nursing or nurse you want to be, because after you graduate, most nurses, new nurses, will go into a general practice, meaning that they'll go into medical surgical. And this is a non-acute unit where they see patients with a lot of times chronic diseases. The ratio of patients may be 1 nurse to 4 or 5 patients, depending on the census of that unit. As you go to the later stages of your bachelor's program, they will put you into different clinicals. So you will have experience in the emergency, the psychiatric, also surgical, OBGYN, labor and delivery, postpartum, or medical surgical, med-surg. In my program, they didn't take us to the intensive care unit, and that's one of my first jobs as a newly grad. I went to intensive care unit. I wanted to be taking care of patients in more of a fast pace. So emergency room nursing or intensive care nursing seemed a good fit for me. As a registered nurse, once you have passed your exam, I applied for jobs before I took the exam. I was offered a job contingent on that I pass my NCLEX. Now, NCLEX is an exam that takes, I think mine took about 4 hours. And since I took the test, the NCLEX has changed. So I don't know how long these tests are now. Now, you may have to retake it based on your scoring, and they'll tell you right there. It's an immediate feedback or scoring, so you'll know whether you passed or not. I'll say to my students, before you take your NCLEX, start submitting your resumes to units that you think is a best fit for you. Because although there is a nursing shortage, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get the job you want. Many of the hospitals will have 24-hour staff. Most of the times, if you are a new graduate, they will put you in night shift. And for me, I knew way before putting me in night shift, not going to work. But just be aware that if you're going to be working in a hospital in a particular unit as a newly graduate, you might not have the option of working day shift. Most of the new grads that I know started out working the night shift, which is 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. But just know that 12 hours is technically not exactly 12 hours, because you come in at 7, whether it's 7 p.m. or 7 a.m., you wait for the previous shift to give you a report. So you might be there for another 15 to 30 minutes. It's not really 12 hours, it's 12 and 30 minutes. It's a long 12-hour shift. And most hospitals will give you an option of what days you want to work, and it's scheduled so that you know at least 3 weeks out what your schedule is like, and then you would request the schedule. You might not get all the days you want. And most of the hospitals will have certain days you have to work in terms of holidays. The good thing with working holidays, it is a extra pay. So that was one of the benefits. And if you do end up on the night shift, there is a night shift differential. If you're one of those night owls and you like the nights and you're wide awake, I would opt to go work at night. It's also quieter too at night, and also less management, of course. So your autonomy may be greater during night shift. One of the difference in the hospital scheduling is that some hospitals were unionized and some were not. This is my thinking and this is my opinion, is that I didn't lean towards the unionized hospitals because one of the things that I struggled with is that if I was in a union, I didn't want to strike. It just was not for me. But it might be for you. It's okay either way. If you end up going to a unionized hospital, at least the unionized hospital that I interviewed with, if you are a newly graduate nurse, then they put you in a schedule where you're kind of at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of selecting your schedule. So you might have both on some certain days you have day shifts and certain times you have night shifts. So you have virtually no control over whether your work hours are days or nights or both. For me, that kind of scheduling was probably not good for my health. So I opted not to work for that hospital, but that hospital was extremely well regarded. It's a great hospital, but I decided not to do that for those reasons. I did end up interviewing before my exam, and I landed in intensive care unit. Most hospitals, if you're newly graduate, they have certain sets of programs that if you're working in the emergency room, if you're working in the ICU, if you're working in labor and delivery. So those are things you want to ask your potential employer is, what kind of new grad program do you have? Am I going to be left alone and fend for myself when this is my first job? Once you graduate and you're interviewing, ask your employer, because your first job is going to be really important in terms of how well you do in the first year. There's a lot of nurses, newly grad nurses, that quit within the first year because they didn't provide enough support. It's your responsibility to also interview your potential employer as well. And I think one of the biggest question is, do you have the program? Will I have the mentorship? And how does that mentorship look like? For example, in the IC unit that I worked at, the program was, it's been a long time, but I think it was like 4 weeks, the newly grad program. After the official period where you shadow your mentor in your shift, which is a fantastic way of learning. So don't be nervous. You're not going to be out there by yourself. You will have mentorship, or find an employer that provides structure where you can get the right training. Usually what'll happen is that the mentorship will be extended based on how well you do. A lot of times they can extend that mentorship 2-3 months out. Or after the mentorship, they will have kind of a meeting to see how you're doing. You can request more mentoring if you want to. That's something that is not looked down upon. Most places, most hospitals want you to succeed, right? Because you're in a job that you're taking care of people, you're taking care of patients. So they want you to not make a mistake. They want you to do your job well. If you need support, resources, do not be afraid of asking for those, because they're there for you to succeed. So whatever you need, be sure to be vocal. I think sometimes these new grads are afraid because if they ask something, they may think that the managers or your mentor don't think that you can do the job. But that's not the case. So ask if you really do have any questions and need your help. And that goes when you're doing your clinicals in your bachelor's program. A lot of times I think what happens is people are scared to ask. It's important that if you have a question, ask. I am one of those students that if I had a question, I ask regardless of whether it looks stupid or not. And it's so funny because in that regard, I approached one of my professors after I graduated from bachelor's at a different school getting my master's. And I said, "Do you remember me?" My professor at my bachelor's program said, "Yeah, I do. You're the student that kept on asking questions, right?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I guess I did ask a lot of questions." And if you're going through any schooling, it is the best opportunity to ask questions because there is no stupid question. And I say that to my students that please ask. If you have something in your mind that you're not too sure of, ask, because I can guarantee you there's probably another student with that same question. Don't worry about offending anyone, because who cares? This is your education. If you're going into nursing, you have to know the facts. You have to have those critical thinkings. You have to raise questions. Even in practice, you have to raise a lot of questions, because if you don't, and there is a mistake, because you're administering, because you're doing the actual work, if it's a mistake, you are technically at fault. So think about that. If you're not sure of something, ask. So going back to my job, I worked in the ICU unit, and those of you who are thinking about going to the ICU, I really loved that experience. I think it's an absolute great experience to have as a new grad, because you get to see diseases, you get to see your patients multiple times. So it's not like in the ER, and I did work in the ER after ICU. With ICU, you learn so much about medications, about life and death, about the dynamics of family when it comes to their loved one. One of the things about ICU that I did not anticipate is that, at least in this particular ICU, it was the nurse's responsibility once a patient passed away to clean up the patient with the help of what we call a health aide. These are people, or hospital used to call them transporters. They would help me wheel the patient to our morgue. In the ICU that I worked at, so it was our responsibility to take the patients to the morgue. And I always remember the steps I took, opening the door of the morgue, opening the refrigerator. So you know how when you see those crime shows where they show you where the autopsy is done, you see shelves that is metals, and they open the door up and they take out a body. That's what we had. What became a bit surreal, these are patients that I had to take care of, perhaps even for weeks, because sometimes these patients would have issues and they would come back and come back. So they were readmitted to the ICU. To see their bodies become lifeless and they're no longer, whether you call it a soul, that person is no longer in the body, and then having me and one of the helpers will the body. And a lot of times, actually most of the time, there were no family members, and I found that kind of strange. Whether there were family members or not, I did, as I put the body into these refrigerated cubes, I said a certain kind of prayer. I'm not religious, but I wish them a journey that was not alone, because I was really sad that the life was no longer in this body, and that I was just putting a body into a place forever. So whoever that person was no longer there. I find that. And working in the ICU, I saw more deaths in the span of the year I worked than in the emergency room, and I worked there about 7-8 years. One of the hardest days for me in the ICU was having to put 2 patients in the morgue in the span of 12 hours. That was extremely draining, and I think it's one of the reasons I decided not to work in the ICU anymore. There was an incident with my nurse manager, and it was that day with the 2 patients who died. One of the things about hospitals, regardless of whether it's profit or non-profit, there's always patients, always going to be patients that need to be admitted to ICU. Availability of these beds become a commodity. We do keep the bodies after a patient is pronounced dead for 4 hours in that same room, because that gives a window for family members to come and do their last viewing before we transport the patient, the body, to the morgue. And the ICU is usually very busy. And that particular day, I had 2 patients that passed away. My manager didn't ask me how long the first patient that died was in the room. I had to remind her, because she wanted to know why the body was not in the morgue. I keep saying patient, but it was really just a body now. I had called the family members to let them know. The rule is that the body is allowed to be there for 4 hours so that family members can see the body and not in the morgue. So the nurse manager, rather than ask me how long the first patient that passed away was in the room, she wanted to know why they were not in the morgue yet. And I had to remind her that it hasn't been 4 hours. I think it was like 90 minutes. And that got to me to the point where I realized that it's all about business and it's not about a person's life. After that, I had decided not to work in the intensive care unit because I came into nursing because I wanted to. It's all about the patient. I wanted to take care of patients. But having realized that the hospital system itself is really looking about turnover, I'm going to pause this video because I'm getting kind of emotional about this. And let me pause, and then I'll get back and continue with the story about why you want to become a nurse.